Hines, and Michael Noddy.
Without objection.
Mr. President, we've all talked about what the primary goal is right now in the Senate. It is to reopen the federal government, but that's not all we need to reopen right now. As we focus on ending this shutdown, I've come to speak in support of a disapproval resolution that is now pending. This is HJR 106. This is the companion to the resolution that Senator Sullivan and I have introduced to reopen the Central Yukon Resource Management Plan after the BLM finalized it over our objection last fall. So the formal name of this rule is the Central Yukon Record of Decision and Approved Resource Management Plan. The name is big, and it is a really big area encompassing nearly 56 million acres, mostly in northern and interior Alaska. So whole state of Alaska, but it is this central area here that is really quite substantial. And not all of that is federal land. You'll see the different colors here. In fact, most of it is not. This RMP is only supposed to affect 13.3 million acres managed by BLM. Now that is still a lot of land. To kind of put it into perspective, it's more than twice the total acreage of Maryland, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Hampshire, and Vermont. So that's what you're looking at here within this region. So we do need an RMP, a resource management plan, to guide management of the Central Yukon's federal acres. This plan is meant to replace older regimes that were put in place back in 1981, 1986, and 1991, as well as some lands that are unplanned. So this is a big undertaking. It's been going on for a long time, started back in 2013, 12 years ago, costing taxpayers millions of dollars to complete. I didn't want to have to overturn this RMP because I really do respect much of the work that was done, certainly the people who worked really hard to do it. And I also recognize that some Alaskans support pieces of last year's final plan and are concerned that their input could be lost if it is reopened. But the problem that we've got here, and why we're taking this resolution up today, is that the Biden administration, which was in office during the last few years of this 12-year process, really has left us with no choice here. They lost sight of the need for balanced management. They dropped any pretense of it from the final plan. So despite objections from me, from Senator Sullivan, the state of Alaska, many Alaska stakeholders, BLM kind of plowed ahead and they finalized a plan that overwhelmingly prioritizes conservation but fails to reflect the principle of multiple use that is required with our public lands, and fails to honor the explicit requirements of federal law. There are some very significant issues within this plan. There are further deficiencies based on what BLM pledged to do and then refused to do. And that combination is what caused us to file this resolution and to seek a more balanced plan going forward. So, going through those problems in a little bit greater detail. I expect that one of the things that you're going to hear today in opposition is that this is unprecedented, that Congress is now overturning 12 years of non-political, legally sound agency work. And Mr. President, if that were true, I wouldn't be standing here in opposition to this. I would be a no on the resolution, but that's not where we are. In December of 2020, in BLM's 8th year of work on this RMP, the agency released a draft plan with a pretty reasonable preferred alternative. This is a proposal that would have protected sensitive areas. It would have upheld subsistence and recreational uses. It would have provided opportunities for resource development and other legal uses on BLM land. And under that proposal, many outdated public land orders, we call them PLOs, would have been lifted, and the majority of BLM's lands would have then be accessible. But just a few years later, we saw a very different preferred alternative emerge from BLM. This was in the middle of the Biden administration. The final record of decision issued last November is 362 pages long. There are multiple appendices that total another 1,428 pages. So it's 1,800 pages. I can't. This is the stack of the maps and the pages of the final record of decision. 1,800 pages showing these various designations and restrictions. This is in no way a user-friendly plan. It's not a printer-friendly plan, that's for sure. But it's also not a BLM employee-friendly plan. It's long, it's complex, and unless you're really super invested in learning what was designated as Visual Resources Management Class 2, as opposed to Class 3 or perhaps Class 4, you're probably not really going to enjoy reading it. The differences between what the BLM proposed in 2020 and what BLM finalized in 2024 show really how this process went off the rails. So giving you a couple examples here. In 2020, BLM proposed one area of critical environmental concern, we call them ACECs, and resource natural area. These are administrative withdrawals for conservation that restrict other uses. And this covered 77,000 acres. Then last year, BLM's final RMP balloons this to include 21 ACECs and RNAs covering 3.6 million acres. This is imposing restrictions on nearly 47 times more land. In 2020, BLM proposed 497,000 acres of special recreation management areas. In 2024, we saw that triple to 1.453 million acres. In 2020, BLM proposed little over 1 million acres of utility and transportation corridors. In 2024, that fell by 2/3 to just 33,000 acres. In 2020, BLM proposed to have almost 7.5 million acres open to fluid mineral leasing, and then in 2024, it leaves just 845,000 acres open. That's 89% less. So you can see the dramatic differences between the plan in 2020 and the plan in 2024. There's a lot more I could go through, but the point is restrictions exploded in the final plan, while opportunities for economic development were severely curtailed. And we saw it over and over in Alaska over the last 4 years. We don't think it was any accident. You've heard my colleague speak on the floor about this a great deal, but it was just really the last administration's goal to reduce and curtail many of these activities. BLM's treatment of public land orders, which have been obsolete in Alaska for decades, also backslid dramatically. And these came to be in the 1970s when Alaska's land ownership was greatly unsettled, but they should have been revoked a long time ago. In 2020, BLM proposed to revoke 5.863 million acres of so-called D1 withdrawals. But then in 2024, BLM zeroes that out. And instead, they've only lifted withdrawals for one narrow purpose. It's an important purpose, but it's very narrow, and that's allotments for eligible Alaska-Vietnam veterans, but no others. In 2020, BLM proposed to lift PLO 5150, reflecting state and native selections around our Trans-Alaska Pipeline Corridor. But then in 2024, BLM reverses course, refused to lift a single acre of PLO 5150 within the RMP process. And the problem is that BLM told us, they told me, they told my team, that they would address PLO 5150 through a separate process. They called it a tiered environmental assessment. And they said that that was going to begin immediately after the finalization of the Central Yukon RMP. But they just had to get to that point, and they just needed us to back off so they could. Guess what never happened? The day after the state of Alaska's consistency review period for the Central Yukon RMP ended, BLM canceled its separate process for PLO 5150. It was an absurd decision. BLM spent years telling us that they could only lift public land orders within the RMP process, and then as the Central Yukon RMP nears completion, they then tell us that they can only lift one of the most visible PLOs in Alaska outside of it. And then as soon as we reach that point, they break their promise, immediately pulling the whole thing down. My team was actually on the phone with BLM when this happened. They asked about the process, and they were told everything is on track, everything's going just fine. And right after, probably not even more than 30 minutes after that, BLM calls state officials to tell them it's off and never coming back. If that's not a bait and switch, I don't know what is. But this is where you can start to see how BLM's actions, both what it did and what it refused to do in this RMP, directly contradict multiple federal laws. The first is ANILCA, the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act. That was Alaska's grand bargain. This is where Congress withdrew and conserved tens of millions of acres in our state in exchange for reasonable opportunities for economic development, whether it be within the 1002 area, the Ambler Road, but this was the deal back in 1980. And to confirm that Alaska had done its part for national conservation, ANILCA also includes several what we call no more clauses, reflecting the fact that we were done, no more wilderness needed to be designated in the state of Alaska. It should be pretty apparent that unilateral administrative designation of 3.6 million acres of ACECs, dozens of other restrictions across millions of other acres, and the retention of virtually all land withdrawals, which were supposed to be lifted decades ago, are all directly contrary to ANILCA. The Central Yukon Plan also conflicts with a law that I wrote called the Alaska Land Transfer Acceleration Act. Some people around here are still surprised that Alaska's land ownership is still not settled yet. 66 years after statehood, neither our state nor our native land entitlements have been fulfilled. We've got millions of acres remaining outstanding on both of these, and their settlement hinges on the federal government making available and then transferring selected lands. Congress agreed to enact my Alaska Land Transfer Acceleration Act back in 2004, and we set this goal that our land entitlements would be complete by 2009. That was the 50th anniversary of statehood. Well, that didn't happen, but some good did come from it. BLM surveyed its land withdrawals in Alaska, and then in 2006, there was a report to Congress that recommended that 95% of them, covering 152 million acres, could be lifted consistent with the protection of the public's interest. And the only caveat here was that BLM preferred to lift its orders through its land planning process. So we worked with them. We pushed to make that happen. We've appropriated funding to make it happen. But when BLM undertakes a new RMP and decides that not a single acre of a single PLO can be lifted across 13.3 million acres for any other purpose other than native allotments, you're going to see patience run out. And it turns to frustration, it turns to opposition, and it takes us to where we are today, which is congressional disapproval of a resource management plan. Now, I would also point out that the Central Yukon RMP conflicts with ANCSA, or the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. The regional ANC in the Central Yukon area, Doyon, has rightly pointed out that BLM's actions in this RMP would make it difficult, if not impossible, to utilize its lands for the benefit of its people in line with congressional intent. In a letter to Alaska's congressional delegation, Doyon explained how BLM's restrictive land designations will, quote, complicate access to and use of Doyon lands and potentially prevent Doyon from fully realizing the economic and other benefits that Congress intended it would enjoy as a result of ANCSA's settlement of Aboriginal claims. So, Mr. President, I'd ask that unanimous consent that the letter be included as part of the congressional record immediately following my remarks.
Without objection.
And, Mr. President, we also received a letter of support for this resolution from the North Slope Trilateral, which includes the Inupiat community of the Arctic Slope, the North Slope Borough, and the Arctic Slope Regional Corporation, ASRC. And their letter lays out in a series of fundamental flaws within the final Central Yukon Plan, including its failure to account for North Slope priorities, the impact that it would have on native lands, the barriers it creates to cooperative land management, the restrictions it imposes to foreclose the production of rare earth elements and other resources, as well as the lack of consultation with Alaska natives who live on the North Slope during its development. As the trilateral writes, quote, "The result is a plan that ignores congressional intent under both ANCSA and ANILCA, disregards the economic needs of North Slope communities, and creates unnecessary obstacles to infrastructure, energy, and community health across northern Alaska." So again, Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent that the letter from the North Slope leaders be printed in the congressional record.
Without objection.
So, Mr. President, the sad part is that what these Alaskans are pointing to, restrictions that encumber access to lands and opportunities, was largely the point of BLM's final RMP. And that, again, points to why we're here to disapprove this plan. Now, I should point out that there's a big misunderstanding about the effects of this resolution. There's been some false claims out there. I think there's been some kind of sloppy reporting of them. But when the House passed this resolution, we saw over and over again in different articles that somehow or other that passage of that resolution had approved the Ambler Access Project, which is not the case. That project has been in permitting for a decade, and then just on Monday, President Trump issued a determination reapproving it, which we appreciate, but nothing in this disapproval resolution approves that project. So that's just misinformation out there. But what is true is that over the course of decades, Congress has ceded a lot of authority on federal land management to the executive branch. We trust them to follow the laws that we've made, find a balance between competing uses and priorities. And we know it's not an easy job, especially in a state where you have more than 223 million federal acres. But when the agencies lose sight of that, it's our job here, it's our responsibility to rein them in, and that's what we're doing. We're reminding BLM that these are public lands that are generally available for multiple use, not exclusively conserved lands with layer after layer of administrative restrictions heaped onto them. Before I end here, I'd like to briefly discuss what comes next if we're able to pass this disapproval resolution. It should be very clear. Passage does not invalidate 12 years of agency work. It does not overturn the environmental analysis that's been done or the public comments that have been received. We are simply reopening this plan, and we're telling BLM, return, come back with a new one that is more balanced. And that shouldn't be hard, and it shouldn't take that long because the plan already exists. It was just abandoned once the Biden administration took office. For 8 years, BLM was on the right track in this process. It has a ready-made plan in the form of its preferred alternative from 2020. The record of decision from last year even acknowledges that the 2020 preferred alternative features a, quote, blend of resource protection and resource development. It's an actual balance between the two, and that's what we should be seeking. It's time to go back to that proposal, update it as needed based on the passage of time, and put into place a final Central Yukon plan that maintains access, respects multiple use, and conserves where necessary and appropriate. And it's entirely possible to serve the varied interests of this region. And through this resolution, that's exactly what we're telling BLM to do. And when they do, we'll have a final Central Yukon resource management plan that Alaska's delegation, the state of Alaska, the largest landowner in the region, Doyon, and a wide range of Alaskan stakeholders can support. So I would urge my colleagues to support this resolution. I yield the floor to my colleague from Alaska who has worked very, very hard on this resolution, and appreciate his leadership of the same.